European leaders, Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, just wrapped up a phone call, a video teleconference between the sides ahead of Trump's meeting in Alaska with Vladimir Putin on Friday. The intent was to have unity on the side of the Western people before Trump goes in there to try and have a conversation with Putin. There was some hope originally that something could break on this meeting between Trump and Putin, perhaps an end to the war, perhaps a ceasefire. Perhaps some kind of deal that would wrap this whole thing up. But as we've started to see, even before this phone call happened, more and more information is coming out that this is actually going to be a road to nowhere. And to try and help us make some sense out of this, we have one of our favorite guests, Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and just an exceptional person. Welcome back to the show, John. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Danny. As always, it's a pleasure to be here.
And, you know, I when I first heard about this, I thought, okay, well, if both Trump and Putin agreed to meet in person, something must be close, because ordinarily when you get heads of state, especially these two heads of state, that apparently lots of groundwork has already been done and some kind of agreement is near so that they can get together and announce it. But the closer we've got to this, even before today's conference call, the United States already lowered expectations by saying, well, this is probably just going to be a listening session to kind of hear out President Putin. And I first of all, the first thought occurred to me is, well, I mean, you could just pick the phone up if that's all you're going to do. You've already had, I think it's 3 phone calls between the two. Why not just have another instead of a big summit on American soil? What do you think is really going on with Trump here?
Well, there's no preparation for this meeting. It's not like the two sides had been working hard to figure out how to solve the problem. They had come to a rough agreement on what to do, and then they were just going to get together and consummate the deal. That's not what happened here. What happened is that Trump foolishly put himself in a position where he had to put secondary sanctions on Russia on August 8th. And he quickly understood that this was not something he wanted to do. So the question is, how do you back out of this situation that you've gotten yourself into? And there was a very simple solution to that. He sent Witkoff scurrying off to Moscow to meet with Putin and to ask for a meeting. You know, the West likes to make the argument, Zelensky likes to make the argument that it was Putin who desperately wanted this meeting. On the contrary, it was Trump who desperately wanted the meeting because he wanted to avoid having to put sanctions on Russia on August 8th. So he got his meeting. Again, there's no preparation for it. There's no way the two sides can reach any sort of agreement. So what you're going to get on Friday is no real settlement. And Trump now has an opportunity to escape, at least temporarily, from secondary sanctions.
Okay, so I may be asking the impossible of you here, but let's just look at the track record that or the run up to that discussion or that claim by Trump. Is first he had a 50-day deadline that he was going to impose secondary sanctions and tariffs and all that on Russia. Then he shortened it to 10 days. Now we're really going to do this. And then 2 days before that 10 days was up, he did slap at least a promise of tariffs on India. We'll see if that actually comes to pass. But then actually, bypass, as you said, he literally ignored the Friday deadline on 8 August and is going for this. But then the question is, if he wanted to avoid the sanctions, why did he make the claim in the first place that he was going to do it?
Because he shoots from the hip. This is not somebody who thinks carefully and seriously about how to conduct foreign policy. He thinks he can, just say whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And if he gets into trouble, he can, in Houdini-like fashion, get himself out of trouble. And in a very important way, he's done that. He escaped from having to levy sanctions or tariffs, whatever, on secondary tariffs on Russia on August 8th. He got away with it. But the problem is that he's not solved the Ukraine problem. He's not improved relations with Russia at all.
Well, so what do you make then of the one exception to that, where he did slam, at least so far, another 25% tariff on India? Now, it didn't go into effect until 21 days after, so we'll see if when that 21 days expires, whether that happens. But what is your understanding of why he would have isolated out India, of all people, to put 25% tariff on related to Russian oil sales?
Well, there's two countries he can put the crosshairs on. One is China and the other is India. And we've already learned that he cannot put the crosshairs on China because it has huge leverage over us, because it controls all sorts of things that we need. So he couldn't go after the Chinese. It was easier to go after India. But you want to remember that the goal here of secondary sanctions is to punish the Russians by getting India to stop importing all of this Russian oil. That's the goal. And India has made it unequivocally clear that it is not going to stop importing Russian oil. So even if he hurts India somewhat, he's not hurting Russia, because India is not going to stop importing Russian oil. So it's all for naught. And he, of course, understands this. The fact is that secondary sanctions is not a meaningful threat against Russia.
And so, can we assume then, by that same logic, if Trump wanted to get out of sanctions, didn't want to have to impose them on there, it certainly would seem reasonable that Russia also wouldn't want to have them imposed on them. However much they are sanctions resistant, they probably wouldn't want to add any more. Is that the reason why President Putin would accept this conversation when he knows it's likely not going to result in anything?
He surely knows it's not going to result in anything. He surely understands, like you and I do, exactly what he's dealing with here. But this is an opportunity for Putin to show the world that he is a reasonable statesman, and that he can meet with Trump and he can talk in a civilized and smart manner. It's also an opportunity for him to explain to President Trump in person exactly what his demands are and why those demands are in large part non-negotiable. Seems to me that President Trump has not gotten the word on what real Russian demands are. And this is an opportunity for Putin to tell Trump about those demands. So it's a nice situation for Putin. And by the way, he gets to come to the United States. He's putting his feet in American territory, and that works to his political advantage at home and abroad. So Putin is not going to lose here, in my opinion. And therefore, I think it made good sense for him to accept the invitation.
Now, ordinarily, one might suggest that for the president of the United States, if he convenes this big summit, especially on American territory, and then walks away with literally nothing and doesn't get any kind of either concession or agreement from the Russian side, that might be viewed as a loss. But this is not a normal presidency. This is not a normal time. How do you see from the President Trump side if the expected happens and nothing is agreed to by anyone after Friday?
I think it's going to damage Trump. I think it's important to understand that Trump had a honeymoon period. It lasted a couple months. And I think we're now past the honeymoon period. And I think people are beginning to look at what Trump has accomplished. And on the foreign policy front, he's been largely unsuccessful, especially with regard to settling the Ukraine war. You remember he said before he was even in the White House that he was going to shut this one down, maybe before he moved in, but certainly right after he moved in. And not only has he not shut it down, but he's facing a real problem. We haven't talked about this, but events on the battlefield are turning against Ukraine. And one can only wonder what the situation on the battlefield will look like on Friday when the two leaders get together, and what the consequences of that will be for their meeting. The Ukrainians, and we can get into this, of course, are really in bad shape. The Russians are doing very well on the battlefield, unexpectedly so. And this, I think, will put Putin in an even stronger position on Friday than we anticipated a week ago.
Yeah, and in fact, we are definitely going to get into that here in a minute. But the other party that should be occurring to as a real issue here is both the Ukrainian and the European side. But based on comments just an hour or so ago, it doesn't seem like that battlefield reality is getting through to anybody in Europe. Let's look, first of all, at what German Chancellor Merz had to say after the meeting with Trump and Zelensky on that phone call about what the Europeans' demands are.
We made various things clear for the negotiations. We made it clear that Ukraine has to be at the table if there are any follow-up meetings. We want to have negotiations in the right order. A ceasefire has to be the beginning of it. Important elements should then be agreed in the framework agreement. And thirdly, Ukraine is willing to discuss territorial questions, but then the contact line needs to be the starting point, and legal recognition of Russian-occupied territory is not part of discussion.
So all we're saying is that there's nothing about territory is going to be on the table, and that there has to be what they're calling an unconditional 30-day ceasefire first. That's what has to happen first. What do you think is going to happen?
We know it's going to happen. The Russians are not going to agree to a ceasefire. The Russians are not going to change their major demands for a peace settlement. And this all means that the war is going to be settled on the battlefield. I mean, we've been listening to the European leaders and the Ukrainians make these same arguments over and over for months now. It gets boring at a certain point, but they continue to repeat these arguments, and they're going to go nowhere. And again, it's going to be settled on the battlefield.
Now, here's a puzzling thing. So that was Merz basically still saying what we want. But then after the meeting, you had Emmanuel Macron, who kind of came out and said, this is what we discussed with Trump. Now, if Trump had been talking earlier about last week, he said about swapping territories and some other things, he seems to have been swayed. And this is getting something Doug McGregor talks about a lot. It seems like Trump is swayed by whoever the last person to talk to him was. And then here is Macron, apparently with some kind of an agreement from Trump on exactly what needs to happen next.
Le deuxième élément sur lequel les choses ont été très claires et exprimées ainsi par le président Trump, c'est que les questions territoriales qui relèvent de l'Ukraine ne peuvent être négociées, ne seront négociées que par le président ukrainien. Et c'est la position que nous soutenons. Elle a été très clairement exprimée par le président Trump, et donc elle augure d'une réunion à venir.
So, yeah, that's partially what Merz just said a second ago, is that there's all that's going to have to be negotiated by Ukraine, and we're not just going to give anything away. And that's the complete opposite of what the Russians say. As a matter of fact, it was the Russian Foreign Ministry released a statement that said, heading into Alaska, if anybody thinks there's going to be territorial swapping that's going on, they're going to be disappointed. One of the foreign minister spokesmen said, you don't even need to invent something here. The territorial structure of the Russian Federation is enshrined in the constitution of our country. That says it all. Therefore, with regard to the goals of the Russian delegation in the negotiations in Alaska, they are dictated exclusively by national interest, i.e., they will not withdraw from any territory, and they will not back off of their requirement that what Putin said on June of 2024, which is that it's the administrative border of all four territories, not just the line of contact. So you're already setting the stage before Trump even steps foot in Alaska that the conditions that each side said they're willing to do are still miles apart. So I know it circles back to your original statement. Nothing is going to be resolved in Alaska.
You know what I find amazing here, Danny, is that the Russians laid out their basic position. Putin laid out the Russians' basic position on June 14th of 2024. And nothing has changed since then. And he and his colleagues in Russia have repeated those positions time after time. And yet the West seems incapable of understanding what the Russian position is. And they keep demanding a ceasefire, for example, and the Russians have said there will be no ceasefire until you accept their basic demands. But nevertheless, the West continues to insist on a ceasefire, and it continues to pretend that it really doesn't know exactly what those demands are. I sort of don't understand what's going on here. And again, why even have this meeting? What is the purpose of this meeting other than to get President Trump out of the pickle that he put himself in? There's just no point in it. They don't agree on the basics of a settlement. And if you don't agree on the basics of a settlement, why have this meeting?
Yeah, it's going to be. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised. So I think also because of this meeting here, if there was any thought maybe a week ago that Zelensky is going to have to start changing his mind on some things, that seems to have been evaporated here because Zelensky is even more emboldened on his demands, especially after being feted by all the European heads of state. And now on this phone call with Trump, here's what he said after the meeting.
Ukraine must be discussed with Ukraine. We must support three-sided formats of the negotiations. There should be ceasefire, there should be security guarantees. President Trump said that he supports this and about America's readiness to take part.
So he's just saying, look, we're still nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which is what Joe Biden used to always say. You've never heard that from President Trump, but according to Zelensky, Trump is in agreement with him. What do you make of that?
Again, I don't know what to say about our understanding of the Russian position. This is all just kind of crazy. The Russians have made their position clear. Zelensky, the Europeans, and by the way, Danny, we don't talk much about this, but large chunks of the American national security establishment agree with Zelensky and with the Europeans, and they refuse to make any concessions to the Russians. And if they don't make any concessions to the Russians and they continue to demand a ceasefire, and the Russians say there's not going to be a ceasefire, you're just going nowhere. And that's where we are. You can play all these clips from all these people saying these nonsensical things, but you end up in the same place, nowhere.
Well, and I'm sorry, I got that, which ironically is the title of today's episode, The Road to Nowhere. So we're validating that, I guess. But one more here. So this again shows you the malleability of Trump, because you had Zelensky right there say, well, Trump is with me. He's in agreement with me, apparently on this phone call here. But just a couple of days ago, Trump seemed to be very much not with Zelensky.
I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying, well, I have to get constitutional approval. I mean, he's got approval to go into war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody to the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven, and there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land, and the word that they will use is, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine.
So there's Trump on the 11th of August saying, hey, there's these wavy lines and it's complicated, but you're going to have to give up some territory. And, don't tell me, he mocks Zelensky about talking about his constitution, et cetera. And then apparently just an hour or two ago, apparently he agrees with Zelensky that there won't be any swapping of territory unless Ukraine agrees to it, something like that. What do you think this changing view from Trump has what effect does that have on the Russians as they're heading into Friday?
The Russians have seen this kind of behavior, as we have, over and over. There's nothing surprising here. And what the Russians, I am sure, understand is you're not going to get a meaningful agreement on Friday. You're not going to get a meaningful agreement the next Friday or the Friday after that. And this one is going to be settled on the battlefield. And what you want to do if you're the Russians is that you want to go to great lengths to present yourself to the rest of the world and to President Trump as a reasonable statesman. and you want to be willing to talk to Trump if he wants to talk to you. But there's no hope here that you're going to get a meaningful agreement. The best that could happen is that Trump would agree to Russian demands, and he would tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians, you can either accept Russian demands or not. But if you don't accept them, I'm out of here. And it's up to you to negotiate and deal with the Russians. But he's not going to do that, in large part because he's surrounded, Trump is, by advisors who won't allow him to do that. Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio and others will whisper in his ear.
Lindsey Graham among those.
Yeah, he listens to all those people. And as long as he continues to listen to all those people, when he gets on the phone and he talks or gets on Zoom and talks to people like Zelensky, excuse me, and the German chancellor, he's going to end up sounding like he did today.
And, it's, I thought on Sunday, Vice President Vance was on U.S. television and said, we're done funding this war. It's going to, if the Europeans want to do it, they can do it. We're looking for a resolution, but we're done funding this war. So I thought he was actually laying the groundwork for Trump to do exactly as you suggested there by saying, here's a deal, take it or leave it. We're leaving. But now it doesn't sound like Trump is going to do that, because the question is going to be, after the expected happens on Friday and there's no kind of deal on any terms at all, what is Trump going to be left with? Is he going to be going back to, well, we'll just keep funding, or is he going to go back to, well, then we're going to put sanctions on you? I mean, what are the options for Trump?
More of the same. I mean, what else can he do? I would just say, by the way, I think Vance is the one person at the higher echelons of this administration who understands what has to be done. But he's badly outnumbered, and he does not want to get too far out in front on this issue. So he's more or less in the background, and he does not have that much influence on Trump. And the end result is we are where we are, and we're just going to continue to play this game for the foreseeable future diplomatically that leads nowhere. And the war is going to be settled on the battlefield, as you and I have said on countless occasions.
Yeah, and I'm about to get to, that's the very next thing we're going to discuss. But I want to stick this last one on Trump here, because, I mean, what do you think? I mean, he does have some limited options about what he's going to do following Friday if it turns out the way you expect. I mean, he has to do something. Doesn't he? I mean, whether it's sanctions, whether it's more weapons, I mean, where does he go from here? Because he does have some domestic constituents he's got to worry about.
I mean,
I'm just putting this up. This is what he said, that if Putin will face severe consequences for not stopping the war.
That's today?
Just this minute.
Is there video, or is that just a screenshot?
No, I didn't want to grab. He's just answering many questions right now, so he's jumping around as he always does. But I just wanted to get that up.
Well, yeah. I guess if you can grab that sound at some point before we leave, that'd be great. But right there answers the question, I guess, we had. There's going to be very severe questions or sanctions, I guess. So now that looks like the most likely outcome, don't you think?
But what does that mean in practice? Who is he going to put sanctions on? He's going to put sanctions on China? He can't do that. The Chinese control the flow of rare earths to the United States, and they send magnets to the United States that we desperately need. The Chinese have all sorts of coercive leverage over us. And the Indians, the other country that matters here with regard to secondary sanctions, the Indians have made it clear that they cannot agree to Trump's demands. So what is secondary sanctions going to do? And in terms of arming the Ukrainians, he's already arming the Ukrainians. He hasn't shut down the Biden pipeline. And he's told the Europeans they can buy American equipment and ship it to the Ukrainians, which is just a way of saying that American equipment will continue to be sent to Ukraine. It'll just go via Europe, and the Europeans will pay for it. But the Ukrainians are still going to get the weaponry. I just don't understand what he can do. The guy doesn't have any options. This is what I don't understand about this whole process, and what I think is so mind-boggling about it. Yeah. We don't have any coercive leverage over the Russians, and they're winning on the battlefield. And the idea that Trump is going to go to Alaska on Friday and get all these concessions from the Russians. And then if the Russians don't make these concessions, he's going to lower the boom on them. What is he talking about? You know, it just shows you where American foreign policy is at.
It does, and I rather fear that this is just Trump's way to placate his domestic constituents that he needs to have on his side. But then it would also seem to completely bypass what you thought was his reason for having this meeting at all, was just so he could get out of having to have sanctions. But now seems like he's circled himself back around into the same corner to where now he is going to have to do those, whether he wanted to or not. Towards what end, neither of us can figure out.
I think you're exactly right. He does look like he's back at square one.
Yeah, so that's complicated. But now let me get to a part that's not so complicated and is exactly what you've referred to several times in this episode already, and that is the fighting on the ground. Now, as we talked about on our show yesterday, there has been some significant advancements north of Pokrovsk, penetrating up to the last line of Ukraine defenses, which could potentially unhinge the entire Eastern Front. And as Sir Michael Clark here showed this morning, putting the whole Donbass at military risk.
What really matters is this: the Donbass, the area of the Donbass, the area of Donetsk, with Donbass is Luhansk and Donetsk, and this area of Donetsk is not conquered by the Russians. The Ukrainians are holding it, and the briefing is that Putin is demanding that the Ukrainians withdraw from that before he will agree to a ceasefire. And that is completely and utterly unacceptable to Zelensky, and he's made that very clear in the last 24 hours, because they've got a very heavily fortified strip of territory here between the four cities from Slavyansk through to Kostiantynivka. And if they give up that sort of fortress belt, it'll be much harder for the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians eventually moving further westwards towards the Dnieper River. And so this is their best last line of defense in eastern Ukraine.
So he's talking there about what they want to do, but then as this Denis Davidov here, who's very much a pro-Ukrainian mapper and YouTuber, is also very honest, though. He explained on that very area, here's what's at stake.
Yes, I heard the comments that, oh, they advance just with infantry, so for Ukraine it will be the easy task to get rid of them. No, it's very complicated to get rid of infantry. The most complicated thing, actually, because they are small, they're maneuverable, they may hide for a long time in the basements, in the tree lines. Plus, they may use Ukrainian defense line, which they already bypassed their dots, their trenches. So I would say that judging on the current Ukrainian resources, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of this Russian hub, which they created already across the main Ukrainian defense. And yeah, some people say, oh, Dennis, you're panicking, everything is normal, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not normal at all. It's the great threat for Donbass, for the entire group of Ukrainian army. You see, the main part of the Ukrainian army is deployed here.
So what's going to happen if the Russians are able to exploit this? And we don't know if they're going to right now, if they have the operational exploitation forces to make good with that penetration. The Ukraine side, for its part, has already sent the Azov Corps, its last strategic reserve, important to point out, to try and push that penetration back out there. So it's a race to see, can the Ukraine side reestablish control, or can the Russian side exploit it? But in either case, if he's right, and the core of the Ukraine army is in the Donbass area there, and now it's vulnerable to being possibly cut off from the rear, what does that tell you about where the war could go?
Just quickly, to be clear, you saw that big salient. It can go in one of two or two different directions. And the end result is you would have a huge encirclement of all those Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk area, or you could have a huge encirclement of all those forces in the Kramatorsk area. So it's just important to understand that that big salient that you saw on the map represents a really serious threat to the Ukrainian forces in two different places. What's happening here, Danny, is that the Ukrainians don't have sufficient manpower. To put it in slightly more pointed terms, they don't have sufficient infantry forces to man the lines of defense. They have huge, what we call force to space ratio problems. They have small number of troops holding lengthy pieces of the front line. And the end result is that allows the Russians to penetrate. And it's just very important to understand that the Ukrainians simply don't have the troops to rectify that problem. So the Russians are invariably going to make more breakthroughs. The reason that they're making these major league penetrations now for the first time in this war is in large part because the force to space ratio problem has gotten so serious for the Ukrainians. And again, it can't be fixed. Now you say they're sending reinforcements. The problem is once the war becomes fluid like this, everybody's out in the open, you're moving, and the distinction between defense and offense begins to melt away, right? In most of the war, what we've seen is that the defender was down in the ground or in a forested area, somewhat protected, and it was the offender that was moving. The situation you're now moving into when you begin to move reinforcements into this very fluid situation is the distinction between offense and defense disappears, and lots of those Ukrainian forces are moving about on the ground. And that means they're big fat targets for the artillery, the drones, and the glide bombs that the Russians have in huge numbers. So what I think is going to happen here is that as this battle goes on, there's going to be more and more attrition on the Ukrainian side. Of course, there'll be attrition on the Russian side, but I'll address that in a second. There's going to be more and more attrition on the Ukrainian side, and that's going to exacerbate the force to space ratio problem because the two ratios are related. The overall balance of forces is related to the force to space ratio issue. And as the Russians wear down the Ukrainian forces, they decrease the number of available Ukrainian forces, that means that Ukraine's force to space ratio problem just gets worse and worse. Now, if you transition to the Russian side, first of all, the Russians have a huge advantage in firepower, right? So that means they'll end up killing more Ukrainians than Ukrainians kill Russians. But furthermore,
and by the way, on that point, the reports I read out this morning from the Ukraine side said that the Russian use of glide bombs has more than doubled in this area in just the last week or so. So that just reinforces your position on the firepower issue.
Yeah, the glide bomb issue is of enormous importance because the Russians have huge numbers of glide bombs. They're deadly effective. And furthermore, the Ukrainians have virtually no glide bombs. You know, when we talk about artillery, the Russians have artillery, the Ukrainians have artillery. We can talk about the balance of artillery between the two sides. When you talk about glide bombs, one side has them, and that's the Russians, and they are deadly effective. And again, you want to remember, you have to combine those glide bombs with drones and with artillery. And this means that those Ukrainian forces that are moving about on the ground are vulnerable. But again, to go back to the Russian side, it is very important to emphasize that the Russians are mobilizing more and more forces every month. And the number of forces that the Russians have available to wage this war against Ukraine are increasing by the month, not decreasing. You know, there's all this talk in the West about the Russians losing massive numbers of troops. And if you took this stuff seriously, you'd think the Russians have hardly any troops left to wage their offensive with. But this is poppycock. The Russians have lots of forces, and they've actually been deploying the forces that they have over the past year or so quite carefully so as to minimize the number of casualties. So again, the overall force balance is shifting. The overall force balance is shifting against the Ukrainians, who are now out in the open. And furthermore, the force to space ratio problem, which is disastrous at the moment, gets worse with the passage of time. So it's just a question of how long it takes the Russians to penetrate the front lines and encircle these Ukrainian forces and push on to the Dnieper.
And that certainly appears the most logical likelihood. So that's really these conversations that happen in Berlin today, and then the ones that are going to be in Alaska tomorrow, seem to be operating on the assumption that we've got plenty of time and we'll slap sanctions and that's going to make Russia do something or whatever, but we can avoid the hard decisions about giving up territory to probably the only thing that could stop Russia's offensive onslaught is an agreement to the June 2024 terms. How do you see that?
You and I have long agreed on that. And nevertheless, Zelensky and his fellow Ukrainian leaders and the Europeans refuse to accept that logic. And again, Keith Kellogg and many American policymakers do as well. And the end result is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield. I think the only interesting question here is what happens to the Ukrainian army over time. In other words, let's assume that the Ukrainian army begins to collapse in the Donetsk area or in the Donbass, and the Russians begin to push toward the Dnieper. What does that mean for Russian forces in other regions? Do you have a near total collapse of the Ukrainian military? Is it a partial collapse? Where do they retreat to? What do the defensive lines look like? I've never believed that the Russians were going to try to win a decisive victory. In other words, a victory where they conquered all of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. I believe you will end up with the Ukrainian rump state, and that Ukrainian rump state will have a military. But the question is, how much damage is going to be done to the overall Ukrainian army in the next month or two or three? And what does that mean in terms of Ukraine keeping hold of places like Odessa and Kharkiv and other oblasts in between? If you're the Russians and you listen to the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Keith Kellogg's of the world talk, it seems to me that the lesson that you take from that is you better grab as much territory as you can. You better make sure that that remaining Ukrainian rump state is as crippled as possible, because they're going to try to cause trouble for you for the foreseeable future. And the best way you minimize the amount of trouble that that Ukrainian rump state can take is to take as much territory as possible, certainly to take areas like Odessa and Kharkiv. So I think just how this all plays out in the next couple months in terms of how extensive the collapse of the Ukrainian army will be is of great importance.
It is, and it certainly looks like it's heading that way. Many have projected that. I remember, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's either the first or second time we ever had you on our show, and I believe it was late 2023, where you were warning then that Russia could end up taking 8 oblasts, not just 4. And a lot of people just kind of rolled their eyes at that back then. But now all of a sudden, that's looking more and more plausible and concerning. Listen, I know we don't have much time left here. In the last few minutes we have, I want to get your view on what could come next, not just even the next 2 or 3 months, but once this is resolved, and it's going to be resolved one way or the other, what's going to happen next? Because there's the risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy that Russia is going to come after the West. And in fact, earlier today, General Sir Richard Barons, senior former general in the British Army, made that very argument.
If there is any ceding of Ukrainian territory to Russia, that, of course, will strengthen, embolden President Putin. What are going to be the knock-on effects, in your view, not just for Europe, but for Britain as well?
I think the first and most significant point is, were Ukraine to surrender what is currently 20% of its country in under Russian occupation, that would break the precedent that we do not allow this to happen in Europe that's applied since the end of the Second World War. And it would be extraordinarily naive to think that that was somehow a unique experiment, because in President Putin's eyes, he really wants the whole of Ukraine. And he also has his eyes on parts of what are now NATO that used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And so we must absolutely realize that a bad outcome in Ukraine means that this sort of territorial expansion by force could come to the rest of Europe.
What do you make of why do they keep making that argument over and over? Do they really fear Russia is going to come rolling west, or is this for some other purpose?
Who knows for sure whether they believe it or not? There is zero evidence that Putin is interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There is zero evidence that he is interested in conquering countries in Eastern Europe. I just don't understand how these people can make this argument. Where is the evidence? I want them to show me where Putin said, I want to conquer all of Ukraine and incorporate it into a greater Russia. Where did he say that? He said it nowhere. Furthermore, as you and I both know very well, Danny, he would be out of his mind to try to conquer all of Ukraine, because the western half of that country is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate Russians and would put up great resistance. He would need a huge army to occupy western Ukraine, and that army would be up to its eyeballs in alligators trying to deal with all of that resistance. He's going to have his hands full just trying to reintegrate the eastern portion of Ukraine that he ends up conquering into Russia. That's not going to be easy. He's going to have all sorts of problems. Just think about all the destruction that has been inflicted on that region that's going to become part of Russia. It's very great. So he's not going to try to conquer all of Ukraine. And he's never said that he would. And again, the same thing is true with Eastern Europe. But we have all these people in the West who continue to talk without evidence about Putin's ardent desire to basically reconstitute the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire.
Yeah, I think that just meets our boogeyman, evil Putin mentality that ascribes all those things to him, whether he said them or not. We just take it as an article of faith that that's what he in, because that's what Hitler did. So definitely Hitler and Putin are the same guy. So I just worry about this being a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you have the Russians already saying, it looks to me like the West is gearing up for a war against us. You've had Mark Rutte has said so. German troops are now in the Baltics. More people are talking about building up, that the Russians, whenever this is done, could say, hey, we're not going to just be sitting here and be passive. We also have to up our armament, etc. Do you worry about a self-fulfilling clash between the two sides?
I do worry that there's going to be nothing but trouble for as far as the eye can see between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other side. It's going to be poisonous relations. We're going to be doing everything we can in the West to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine, or in those areas of Ukraine that it incorporates into Russia. And the Russians are going to be doing everything they can to cause trouble in Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine remains a dysfunctional rump state. They're going to do everything they can to sow dissension in the transatlantic relationship, to sow dissension in Europe. I have no doubt about this. And I also, as I've said on the show, think there are potential flashpoints in places like the Arctic, Kaliningrad, the Baltic Sea, Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea for trouble to break out. So I understand all of that. But that's very different than saying that the Russians are bent on conquering all of Ukraine or conquering territory in East Europe. I don't think they're going to do that. Again, I think they're going to build up their defenses. They'd be foolish not to. They're dealing with a highly aggressive West, and they're dealing with a Ukraine that's going to want to restore the pre-2014 borders. So they'll spend a lot of money building up their defenses. And again, we'll have poisonous relations between the two sides. And this is regrettable, but this is where we're headed.
Well, On that cheery note, I know you're out of time here, so we want to respect the time you had here. Also, remind people, if you don't get enough of John because he had to go here, go to John's Substack, where he's got all kinds of interesting information and videos posted. Sometimes even our shows on there. So be sure and turn in there, and we will thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Danny. It was my pleasure being here.
And always our pleasure. And as a quick reminder here, make sure you tell your friends that we're on podcast. Also tell them that Larry Johnson's coming back at I believe it's 2 p.m. Yeah, 2 p.m. Eastern time today, a little over an hour from now, where he's going to be looking at a lot of this from the Russian perspective and what might they do? What might their response be to a lot of this stuff coming out of Europe today and whatever's going to happen with Trump and Putin on Friday. We looked at a lot of the European stuff. We're going to look at the Russian side and see what they think this afternoon. Also, we are on a podcast now. So if you got friends that like to get their information through the audio, please pass this along. Don't let them miss out just because they don't like video. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast, Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and they will find us there. And of course, like John, we are also on Substack. Just it's danieldavisdeepdive.substack.com. And be sure and pass this along too, because a lot of people like to get their information differently, and you want to make sure that they have the same opportunity, this great kind of analysis that we just showed you today, on their own mediums, whatever they like to have. So we appreciate you guys very much. Be sure and like and subscribe. That also helps us out before you leave. And we will look forward to seeing you in a little over an hour with Larry Johnson on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.